Chapter 1. The Awakening. Rila Tan's head throbbed painfully as she slowly regained consciousness. The last thing she remembered was celebrating with her human crew after a successful mission, throwing back a few shots of potent human liquor. But now, something was terribly wrong. Every nerve in her body felt like it was on fire, an unbearable aching need surging through her. Struggling to open her eyes, she winced at the harsh glare of the medbay lights. Dr. Seamers, the ship's medic, loomed over her, his face etched with concern. What happened? Rila rasped, her voice hoarse. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness forced her back down. You had a bad reaction to the whiskey, Seamers explained, his voice steady but laced with worry. Your unique physiology couldn't handle it. Rila groaned inwardly. As an Orlan, she was similar to humans in many ways, yet there were crucial differences, like her crimson hair, pointed ears, and the iridescent third eye in the center of her forehead. That eye now fluttered open, revealing the doctor's aura. Normally a soothing green, it now pulsed an agitated red. There's something you're not telling me, Rila said, narrowing her eyes. Seamers sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. It seems the alcohol interacted badly with the military enhancement serum all soldiers are given. In humans, it boosts strength, stamina, and reflexes. But in you... Ryla's heart raced as the realization hit her, the fire raging through her veins, the desperate ache in her core. She recognized these symptoms all too well. They were part of her species' mating cycle, but never this intense. It's triggered an extreme arousal response, Seamers said clinically, avoiding her gaze. Your hormone levels are off the charts. If we don't get it under control, you could go into shock. The reality of her situation crashed down on her. She was light years from home, the only Orlan on a ship full of humans. Shame and fear swelled inside her. What can we do? She asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. I found a sedative that should help take the edge off, Seamers replied. But Rila, the only real way to relieve the symptoms is by giving in to them. Rila squeezed her eyes shut, hot tears slipping down her cheeks. The thought of asking one of her crewmates for help, of being seen in such a vulnerable state, made her stomach churn. But what choice did she have? I need time to think, she said weakly. Seamers nodded, giving her a sympathetic look. Take all the time you need, just hit the call button if you need anything. He left her alone, the door sliding shut behind him. Rila curled into a ball, her body trembling as she sobbed silently. She had faced enemy troops, hostile wildlife, and the cold void of space, but this was something else entirely. She had to find a way to handle this discreetly, without involving the crew. Summoning her resolve, she uncurled herself and sat up, ignoring the throbbing between her legs. First things first, she needed to get out of the med bay and back to her quarters. She grabbed a hospital gown, slipping it on over her sweat-soaked clothes, and peeked out into the corridor. It was clear. Moving quickly, she made her way back to her cabin, praying she wouldn't run into anyone. Chapter 2. The Fire Within. Rila breathed a sigh of relief as she slipped into her cabin, closing the door behind her. Her small room, sparsely furnished and devoid of personal effects, had never felt more like a sanctuary. Here, at least, she could endure this nightmare in private. She stripped off the hospital gown and collapsed onto her bed, the cool sheet soothing against her feverish skin. Unable to resist, she ran her hands over her body, trying to ease the unbearable ache. A whimper escaped her as her fingers brushed over her breasts, the taut skin of her stomach. It was wrong, shameful, but she was past caring. Her hips rocked restlessly against the mattress, desperate for relief. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. She needed more. The door chime sounded, making her freeze. Rila held her breath, praying whoever it was would go away. The chime rang again, followed by a concerned male voice. Rila, it's Jim. Doc Seamers told me what happened. I just wanted to see if you're okay. Jim Matt, her commanding officer and closest friend on the ship, the last person she wanted to see her like this. But the sound of his voice, usually so steady and reassuring, sent a fresh wave of desire crashing through her. Before she could second-guess herself, Rila staggered to the door and opened it. Jim stood there, his dark brows drawn together in concern. His gaze swept over her disheveled state, the thin sheen of sweat coating her skin, the wild look in her eyes. Rila, what? He began, but she didn't let him finish. Grabbing a fistful of his shirt, she pulled him into the room and sealed the door shut behind him. Chapter 3. Surrender to Desire. Jim stumbled as she dragged him in, but quickly regained his footing. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "Seymour said you needed to rest." "What I need," Ryla panted, advancing on him, "is you." Jim gaped at her, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Ryla knew how she must look, her hair a wild tangle, her body trembling with need, her arousal evident in the damp patch darkening her panties. She looked like an animal in heat, and that was exactly what she was, thanks to the serum reacting with her alien biology. But as she watched, Jim's expression shifted, from shock to something darker, hungrier. His eyes raked over her body, lingering on her breasts, her hips, the juncture of her thighs. When his gaze met hers again, his irises were nearly black with desire. "Are you sure about this, Ryla?" he asked, his voice low and rough. "I don't want to take advantage." "I've never been more sure of anything," she said fiercely. Stepping into his space, she ran a bold hand down his chest, feeling the solid muscles beneath. "I want you, Jim. I need you. Please." With a muttered curse, Jim's control snapped. His large hand seized her hips, dragging her flush against him. Ryla could feel the thick ridge of his arousal pressing against her belly, making her head swim with want. Then his mouth was on hers, hot and demanding. Ryla opened for him eagerly, tangling her tongue with his as her hands fisted in his hair. Jim kissed with the same intensity he did everything else, his focus single-minded, his touch electrifying. It stole her breath and made her knees weak. He walked them backward until the edge of the mattress hit the backs of her thighs. Ryla tumbled onto the bed, pulling Jim down with her, the delicious weight of him settling over her as he nestled between her thighs. She could feel him pressing exactly where she needed him most, and her hips bucked restlessly in response. "Ryla," Jim groaned against her neck, his breath hot on her skin. "I've wanted you for so long." Knowing he desired her, maybe as much as she secretly lusted after him, made her feel powerful, sexy, and desperate all at once. "Then take me," she demanded breathlessly. "I'm yours." With a rough sound, Jim kissed her again, his lips scorching a path down her throat as his hands pushed at her clothes. Ryla arched helpfully, allowing him to strip her tank top off, baring her breasts to his avid gaze. His every touch stoked the fire under her skin, and soon she was lost to the sensations, her world narrowing to the places where their bodies met. They moved together in a frenzied rhythm, chasing their mutual pleasure. It didn't take long before Ryla was shuddering in his arms, crying out his name as she came apart. Jim followed her over the edge with a low groan, collapsing on top of her. For a moment they lay there, tangled together, both breathing heavily. Jim pressed tender kisses to her damp forehead, and Ryla burrowed into his embrace, savoring the feeling of safety and satisfaction. But even as the afterglow faded, Ryla could feel the embers of arousal stirring in her belly once more. Apparently, one round wasn't enough, not with the way the serum had supercharged her hormones. Jim must have felt her tense because he pulled back to look at her, a rueful smile tugging at his lips. "Ready to go again already? I'm not as young as I used to be, you know." Ryla huffed a laugh, tracing the line of his jaw with a finger. "Oh, I think you'll do just fine, Captain. The question is, can you keep up?" A spark of challenge lit Jim's eyes, and he swooped down to capture her mouth in a searing kiss. "Sweetheart, you have no idea what you're in for," he promised against her lips as he proceeded to show her exactly what he meant. Before proceeding, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Chapter 4. Consequences. The next few days passed in a blur of heated encounters and stolen moments. Ryla had lost count of how many times she and Jim had surrendered to their mutual desire, but it was never enough. Every time she thought she'd finally sated the ravenous need burning inside her, it flared back to life with renewed intensity. Jim was tireless, always meeting her with the same fervor, but even he was beginning to show signs of strain. On the fourth day, Ryla awoke in Jim's quarters, her body entwined with his. The room was dim, illuminated only by the faint blue glow of the ship's status lights. For a moment, everything felt normal. Jim's slow, steady breathing was a comforting sound in the quiet. She could almost forget that she was caught in the grip of an uncontrollable biological storm. But as she shifted beneath the covers, the now familiar ache stirred deep within her, insistent and demanding. Ryla stifled a groan, rolling away from Jim and slipping out of bed. She couldn't keep doing this, using him, wearing them both out. It wasn't fair to him. He was her commanding officer, her friend, and she was dragging him into something he'd never signed up for. Rila padded over to the small sink in the corner of his quarters, splashing cold water on her face. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, taking in the dark circles under her eyes and the haunted look in her gaze. This couldn't go on. She needed to find a solution, a real one, not just a temporary fix. She quietly dressed in the spare uniform Jim had lent her and slipped out of his quarters, leaving him to sleep. The corridors were empty at this early hour, and she made her way to the medbay without encountering anyone. Dr. Seamers was there, looking bleary-eyed as he reviewed data on his console. He glanced up when Rila entered, his expression softening with sympathy. "Rila," he greeted, standing up to offer her a chair. "How are you holding up?" "Not well," she admitted, sinking into the chair. This isn't sustainable. Jim and we're both exhausted, and it's not fair to him. I need something that will stop this permanently." Seamers sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I've been researching potential treatments, but it's tricky. Your physiology is so different from human biology, and this situation is unprecedented. The sedatives help a little, but they're not a cure." Rila clenched her fists in her lap, feeling frustration rise up inside her. "There has to be something. What about contacting my home planet? Maybe the oral and medical experts know how to handle this." "I've already sent a message to Aurelia Prime," Seamers said, nodding. "But it could take days, even weeks, for a response. We're deep in uncharted space, and communications are slow." "Days," Rila whispered, dread seeping into her bones. She didn't know if she could last that long, not without something changing. And what if the response was delayed even further? What if there was no cure? Seamers seemed to sense her growing despair and quickly added, "There is one other option, but it's risky." Ryla's gaze snapped to his. "What is it?" "We could try flushing the serum from your system," Seamers explained, his voice cautious. "It would involve inducing a powerful reaction, something like an allergic shock, and then administering a counteragent. It could reset your body's hormonal balance, but it's dangerous. There's a chance it could fail or cause permanent damage." Rila considered his words, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She could continue as she was, pushing both herself and Jim to the brink, or she could take a risk, a big one, that might end this nightmare. "Let's do it," she said finally, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her gut. "I can't keep putting Jim through this. I'll take the risk." Seamers hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right. I'll need a few hours to prepare everything. I'll call you when it's ready." Rila stood, her resolve firming. "Thank you, Doctor. I appreciate everything you've done for me." He gave her a small, tired smile. "It's my job. I just want you to be safe." As she left the medbay, Rila felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. The decision had been made. All she had to do now was wait. Chapter 5. The Cure and the Cost. The hours stretched on, each minute dragging longer than the last. Rila spent the time in her quarters trying to distract herself with reports and ship's logs, but nothing could hold her attention for long. The fire in her veins kept simmering, a constant reminder of what she was fighting against. She thought about going to Jim, but she knew she needed to conserve her strength. The procedure would be risky, and she had to be as ready as possible. When the call finally came from Dr. Seamers, Rila felt a mix of dread and relief. She made her way back to the medbay, her heart pounding in her chest. The sterile, bright room seemed more oppressive than usual, the smell of antiseptic sharp in her nose. Seamers was waiting for her, a tray of syringes and vials laid out on the counter. His expression was grim but determined. "Rila, I need you to lie down on the examination table. We're going to start with a mild sedative to calm your system before we induce the reaction." Rila nodded, climbing onto the table and lying back. The cold metal beneath her was uncomfortable, but she forced herself to focus on her breathing, trying to stay calm. Seamers injected the sedative into her arm, and within moments she felt her muscles relax, the tension easing slightly. "All right," Seamers said, his voice steady. "I'm going to administer the allergen now. You'll feel a sharp sting, and then the reaction will start. I'll be monitoring your vitals closely." Rila swallowed hard, nodding again. She braced herself as Seamers prepared the syringe, her heart thudding in her ears. When the needle pierced her skin, she barely felt it, but the sensation that followed was immediate and overwhelming. A searing pain shot through her veins, starting at the injection site and spreading outward like wildfire. Rila gasped, her body arching off the table as her nerves ignited in agony. Her vision blurred, and she could hear her own heartbeat, loud and frantic in her ears. The room tilted and spun, and she felt like she was being torn apart from the inside. "Stay with me, Rila," Seamers said urgently, his voice cutting through the haze. "I'm administering the counteragent now." Another needle, another rush of sensation. This one cold, like ice water flowing through her veins. The pain didn't stop, but it began to change, the burning giving way to a deep, bone-chilling cold. Rila shivered uncontrollably, her teeth chattering as she struggled to stay conscious. Her third eye, normally closed unless she was in deep concentration, snapped open involuntarily. Through it, she could see Seamer's aura, normally a calm, reassuring green, now shot through with frantic swirls of red and yellow. It wasn't good. Something was wrong. Rila tried to speak, to warn him, but her mouth wouldn't cooperate. Her vision darkened, and the cold spread deeper, sinking into her bones. She felt herself slipping away, her thoughts growing sluggish, as if she were sinking into a dark abyss. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sensation stopped. The pain, the cold, the dizziness, all of it vanished, leaving her feeling hollow and exhausted. Rila lay on the table, gasping for breath, her body trembling violently. Seamers was at her side in an instant, checking her pulse, his face pale with worry. "Rila, can you hear me?" She managed a weak nod, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm here." Seamers let out a shaky breath, relief flooding his features. "Thank the stars. I wasn't sure if—" "You made it through, Rila. The serum's been flushed from your system. Your hormone levels are returning to normal." Rila closed her eyes, tears leaking from the corners. The relief she felt was overwhelming, but it was tempered by exhaustion and the lingering echoes of pain. She had made it barely, but the ordeal had taken its toll. "I'm going to keep you here for observation for the next few hours," Seamers continued gently. "But it looks like the procedure was a success." "Thank you," Rila whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't have done this without you." Seamers gave her a warm, reassuring smile. "Rest now, Rila. You've been through enough." As she drifted into a fitful sleep, Rila felt a sense of peace for the first time in days. The fire had been extinguished, the storm inside her finally calmed. But even in her sleep, a small part of her couldn't shake the nagging thought. At what cost? Chapter 6. A New Beginning. The days that followed were quiet, almost eerily so. Rila spent most of her time in the med bay, recovering under Dr. Seamer's watchful eye. Her body was weak, but slowly regaining its strength. The intense desire that had plagued her was gone, replaced by a profound exhaustion. It was a relief, but also left her feeling strangely empty. Jim visited her often, bringing her reports from the crew, sharing jokes, and keeping her company through the long, slow hours. But there was an awkwardness between them now, a tension that hadn't existed before. Rila could see the worry in his eyes, the way he sometimes hesitated before speaking, as if unsure of what to say. She wondered if he regretted what had happened between them, if he saw her differently now. On the 6th day, Dr. Seamers finally cleared her to return to duty. Rila was relieved, eager to regain some sense of normalcy. She dressed in her uniform, adjusting the collar as she looked at herself in the mirror. The dark circles under her eyes had faded, and her third eye was closed once more, giving her a more human appearance. But she still felt the weight of everything that had happened. When she stepped out of the med bay, she found Jim waiting for her. He was leaning against the wall, his arms crossed over his chest, but he straightened up when he saw her, his expression softening. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Better," Rila replied, managing a small smile. "Ready to get back to work." Jim nodded, but didn't move. There was a long pause, and Rila could feel the unspoken words hanging in the air between them. "Jim," she began, unsure of how to broach the subject. "About what happened." He held up a hand, stopping her. "Rila, you don't have to say anything. What happened? It was intense, but it doesn't change how I feel about you or how I see you. You're still the same person you've always been." Rila felt a rush of relief, but also a pang of guilt. I don't want things to be awkward between us. You're my friend and I care about you a lot." Jim smiled, his eyes warm. "And I care about you too, Rila, more than you know. We'll get through this, together." His words were like a balm to her soul, easing the tension she hadn't realized she was holding. She stepped closer to him, reaching out to take his hand. "Thank you, Jim." For everything. He squeezed her hand gently, then released it. Come on, Lieutenant. We've got a ship to run. They fell back into their familiar roles, the easy camaraderie that had always existed between them slowly returning. But even as they resumed their duties, Rila couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, both within her and between them. The experience had left a mark on her, one that wouldn't fade easily. Chapter 7. The Return of the Past. Weeks passed, and life aboard the starship settled back into its usual rhythm. Rila returned to her duties, immersing herself in the work of navigation and exploration. The crew was as supportive as ever, treating her no differently than before, but Rila knew they sensed the change in her. She was quieter now, more introspective, and the fire that had once burned so brightly within her was now a smoldering ember. One day, as she was finishing up her shift on the bridge, a message came through from Aurelia Prime. It had taken longer than expected, but it was finally here. Rila's heart skipped a beat as she accessed the secure communication channel, her hands trembling slightly as she activated the holographic display. An image flickered to life, revealing the familiar face of High Counselor Karan, one of Aurelia Prime's most respected leaders. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his eyes were a piercing blue, filled with wisdom and concern. Lieutenant Rila Tan, he began, his voice resonant and authoritative, we have received your message and the medical reports. I am relieved to see that you have survived the ordeal. The procedure you underwent was dangerous, but it appears to have been successful. Rila bowed her head respectfully, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension. Thank you, High Counselor. I'm grateful for Dr. Seymour's skill and the support of my crew. Karan nodded, his expression softening slightly. However, there is something you need to be aware of. The serum you were given was not designed with your physiology in mind. While the immediate crisis has passed, there may be long-term effects that we cannot yet predict. Your body has undergone significant stress, and it may take time to fully understand the consequences. Rila's heart sank at his words. She had hoped that the procedure had put an end to her troubles, but now it seemed there was more to consider. What kind of effects? She asked, her voice tinged with worry. We are uncertain, Karan admitted, his gaze steady. But you must be vigilant. Any changes in your health, your abilities, or your mental state must be reported immediately. We will continue to monitor your condition and provide support as needed. Rila nodded, accepting the gravity of his words. I understand, High Counselor. I will keep you informed. Karan gave her a reassuring smile. You are strong, Rila. You have proven that time and again. Trust in yourself, and know that we are here for you. With that, the transmission ended, and the holographic display faded. Rila sat back in her chair, her mind racing. She had thought the worst was over, but now it seemed there was still a shadow hanging over her, a threat that could manifest at any time. She was lost in thought when the door to the communications room slid open, and Jim stepped inside. He took one look at her face and immediately knew something was wrong. What did they say? He asked, concern evident in his tone. Rila hesitated, then told him everything, the High Counselor's warning, the uncertainty about her future. Jim listened quietly, his expression growing more serious as she spoke. When she finished, he reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. We'll face it together, Rila. Whatever comes, you're not alone in this. His words brought her a measure of comfort, but the fear still lingered. What if the changes were already happening? What if she was a ticking time bomb, waiting to explode? As they left the communications room, Rila couldn't help but feel that her journey was far from over. The battle with her own body had been won, but the war was still ahead, and she would need every ounce of strength to face whatever lay in wait. Chapter 8. New Frontiers. The next few weeks were a test of endurance, not just for Rila, but for everyone aboard the starship. The crew embarked on a series of dangerous missions, navigating treacherous asteroid fields, encountering hostile alien species, and exploring uncharted territories. The work was grueling, but it was exactly what Rila needed, a distraction from the lingering uncertainty about her condition. Jim kept a close eye on her, subtly checking in on her well-being without being overbearing. If you enjoy this video, then don't forget to like the video, subscribe to my channel, and hit the notification bell.